Okay, officially welcome to our event tonight about JDs and PhDs and all kinds of great stuff. My name is Francis Shen. I have the pleasure of directing the Dana Foundation Career Network in Neuroscience and Society. I have shared my screen so you can see, and I'll put this in the chat, our neuroxcareers.org website where you can find all kinds of great stuff, including information about events, our virtual career fair that we do in the fall, information on other NeuroX fields. It's a great resource. We hope you check it out. That's all I want to say, other than thank you to the Dana Foundation for making all of this possible. And with that, I will stop my screen sharing and turn it over to Sam Holloway, who is moderating tonight's event. Thanks, everybody. Great to see you.
Thank you, Professor Shen. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sam Holloway. I'm a third-year law student in Professor Shen's lab on neuroscience and society and neuroethics, which we invite you all to explore online as well. And I have the pleasure of moderating this great panel of people who have pursued a JD PhD and who will share some of the things that led them to pursue that experience, as well as some advice and considerations for those of you thinking about that option for interdisciplinary study. So I will go ahead and invite our panelists to introduce themselves just for a little bit of background, and then we'll get into the questions. And at any point, we encourage you all to write in the chat any questions you have, and then also about the last half of our event, we'll reserve for audience members to unmute or type and ask their questions too. So we will first invite our panelists, Jennifer Brown, to introduce herself and give us a little background.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so my name is Jennifer. Very happy to be with you all tonight. I am a JD PhD, very recently minted. I finished both of my degrees in 2023, and I am currently an associate in the Healthcare and Life Sciences division at a large law firm here in Minneapolis. I'm going to save some of my backstory for the first real question, but I'm just going to start out by saying I did not know that this is what I was going to end up doing when I was sitting where you were. I had no idea. I thought I was going to be an English major. So with that tidbit, I'll pass it on to the next panelist.
Thank you, and we'll invite Javier Mesa now.
Thank you, Sam, and I apologize to everyone. I'm having some technical difficulties with my camera apparently on Zoom today, but I'm a sixth-year PhD candidate at the University of Florida. I study the neurobiology underlying cocaine-seeking behaviors using animal models. I'm also a licensed attorney in the state of Florida, where I previously practiced workers' compensation law, property casualty insurance law, and public criminal defense. Happy to be here today speaking with you all.
Thank you. And now for Kennedy Person.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kennedy Person. I am a second-year graduate student in the graduate program in neuroscience at the University of Minnesota. I'm currently working on my thesis project, which is focusing on microglia replacement therapy in Alzheimer's disease. And I plan to attend the University of Minnesota Law School following the conclusion of my PhD. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Professor Meixner.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Meixner. I am a second-year professor of law at the University of Georgia School of Law. I did my JD and PhD at Northwestern. The PhD was in called Brain Behavior and Cognition, and I did a mixture of neuroscience work, partly focusing on lie detection and some more traditional sort of cognitive and social psychology work also. I study mostly criminal law issues now, especially things relating to sentencing, but also crossover between law and psychology more generally.
Thank you. Great to have you. And Thomas Burnett.
Hi, everyone. My name is Thomas. I am a 1L at the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. So I'm happy to see you, Professor Meisner. And I am a former PhD candidate, now master's conferred from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine from neuroscience, where my thesis focused on sensory motor transformation and somatic sensation across organisms.
And last but not least, our own Professor Shen, who introduced himself a little earlier. If there's anything else you want to add, feel free.
Yeah, no, I don't think so, other than to say I direct the Shen Neurolaw Lab, and it's just really neat to see everyone here. We had 221 registrants. We've got 80 people on the call, which I think we were sort of joking, the panelists before, may be more than the total number of current JD, PhD, and neuro people, say, over the last decade or something. So this is an indication of what's going to happen in the future, and it's just exciting to see everyone. I'll stop there.
Thank you. And we're so grateful to all our panelists again for volunteering their time. So with that, we'll get into the questions. First, we want to ask all of our panelists, what is your JD PhD story? What led you to consider the path, whether it's in your career, your personal and professional goals, or otherwise? And we'll go in the same order. So we'll start with Jennifer Brown.
Yeah, this is a funny question, and I have no compunction admitting to you that I faked it for a long time, especially in applying to the programs that I have since graduated from, because everybody wants a story tied up neatly in a little bow. And in reality, I had no idea what I was doing. As I said, I thought I was going to be an English major. I was determined to be an editor for science fiction and fantasy novels, which is still something I dabble in my spare time, but obviously it's not my career. And, you know, I figured it out as I went along. I'd always had an interest in the intersection of science and law, but I didn't know that that's what I was interested in. I was curious in ways, I was like, why in the lab do we do science in this way? What is this entity like the IRB or IACUC that has decided that we shall do such procedures under these regulations? And now I know that that's called policy for science, but back then I didn't have that vocabulary. So I took the LSAT on a whim because eventually it crystallized that what I was really interested in was policy and law. And that's why I was asking all these questions beyond the actual science that I was doing at the time. And I will say that after I was graduated from college, I double majored in neuroscience and psychology. I worked as a postbac for 3 years at Weill Cornell Medical studying spinal cord injury in mice and rats. So I was working as a lab tech essentially while I was deciding whether or not I wanted to go to graduate school and law school. And law school wasn't on my radar for a very long time. It wasn't until I was starting to write my applications for graduate school that I realized there was a large part of what I was interested in that wasn't being addressed by those questions that they ask you in your application. And I took the LSAT on a whim. I bought books off Amazon. I did a couple of practice tests. You know, there are YouTube videos for free up the wazoo about what is the LSAT and how to do it. I watched them over my lunch breaks, and I just sat for it and I said, if it's not to be, I'll do horribly and I won't think about this again. And it turns out I did just fine. And that was what I used going forward. And so when I started looking into dual degree programs, back then there weren't that many established ones. There are way more now. I'm constantly surprised to hear that people are doing dual degrees at schools where when I reached out to email, they said no. So when I started asking, you know, the list of established degree programs is very small. And so I just started emailing registrars where the application, you know, was living on the internet and saying, was it possible for me to do both a JD and a PhD? And a remarkable number said no. And those schools got crossed off my list immediately. The remaining ones, I did the interviews, went through the whole process. And eventually I had my list narrowed down to 3 schools. All of which would have let me pursue a dual degree. And in the end, I chose the University of Minnesota, which is where I finished in 2023. And my dissertation was focused on the role of the alpha-synuclein protein in health and disease. And now I'm working as an attorney.
Thank you so much. And it's interesting you raised the point too of schools not yet appreciating the interdisciplinary potential of the dual degree. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So good that you've teed up that discussion. Thank you. And now we'll have Javier. What is your JD PhD story?
Sure, and I'll start off again noting that this is not a nice clean path. I've done a lot of ping-ponging, and if I'm lucky, I'll continue to do some more. But I, as an undergraduate, was interested in behavior, right? I'm interested in behavior at a collective level. I'm interested in policy and government. But I think questions of behavior can't be separated from sort of the molecular granular forces at play, the biology, the physiology of behavior. And when I sort of try to split the difference between the two as an undergraduate, I ultimately decided to go to law school. I thought it was an easier way to help people. And at the time, I was a little bit more interested in questions of law and government and policy. So I graduated law school about 20, I might date myself here, 2013. And I practiced law in Tampa, Florida for about 5 years. Like I said, doing various things. The thing that I enjoyed the most was working as a public defender. You get to help people. Criminal law, I think maybe someone else on this panel might agree, is not really boring. Keeps you on your toes. The fact patterns are exciting. And I really got a kick out of it. But one thing that I noticed during my time as a public defender is that I had a lot of the same clients, and I had a tough time understanding their motives until they explained to me, a lot in confidence. Sometimes I just figured it out on my own, that the real underlying issue was addiction, was substance use disorder. That's what motivated a lot of them to engage in behaviors that got them before judges and prosecutors. And my experience working with those same personnel I noticed a disconnect between sort of people who, or at least my uh, at the time, bare bones understanding of behavior and what they thought behavior was like. And I thought that this disconnect was a problem because courts and policymakers are in the business of governing behavior, prescribing behavior in all kinds of situations, what you can and cannot do. And I thought that the criminal justice system was doing a real disservice to a lot of defendants who were actually suffering from substance use disorders, not really manifesting devious criminal intent in some sort of caricaturish way. And I thought that I could, knowing what I knew about neuroscience before I did some of this in undergrad, I studied sex behaviors in undergrad. I didn't know much about the neurobiology of addiction, and I thought that I could help bridge that gap in understanding, overcome that disconnect between courtroom players and the sciences of behavior by understanding the molecular dynamics of drug seeking. So I applied to grad school. I got an opportunity here at the University of Florida, and now I do just that. My dissertation research takes a look at how polysubstance use, how the introduction of alcohol use to cocaine use might alter the neurocircuitry of cocaine seeking. I said I work with an animal model. I work with rodents. So yeah, that's kind of my journey. I felt a strong sort of identified a potential weakness in what I think the criminal justice system does. I thought that science could be a way of overcoming that weakness, and so I'm trying to use my experiences in both domains to be a person that helps make things better for everyone.
Thank you. A great look at the intersection of how we behave and why we behave, sort of the science and the law and regulation intersecting. Thank you so much. Kennedy
Sure.
will have to go next. The story of your JD PhD.
Yeah, so I'm kind of where Jennifer was a few years ago, where I knew I wanted to kind of focus on both law and science, but not exactly how the two would come together. So I started off pretty much in high school interested in both. And I got into a scholars program, the Meyerhoff program at UMBC, and decided that that was kind of telling me that I should maybe focus on the science and let the law be on the back burner. And then right as I was about to graduate, I was like, I'm still interested in the law. And I continued, I applied to PhD programs, which was my prescribed path from the start of undergrad, and I got into the University of Minnesota and started my program, but my interest in law was still there. And with the help of my PI, who supported the idea of intersecting, the law and neuroscience, and then talking to Jennifer since she was there, and she kind of forged the path forward of, thinking about a JD PhD. After she did it, people were like, oh, okay, it's not as crazy as it sounds for someone to pursue that. So kind of following that path kind of put me into the thought process of doing a JD PhD. And I thought initially that I would kind of bounce back and forth, and then decided that just finishing out the PhD and then going to law school afterwards would be the best choice for me. And I decided to do both. At least my thought process is that I kind of didn't want to make a choice. I didn't want to kind of stick with one degree over the other and then maybe get 10 years down the line and decide, there's another path for me. So I figured if I have both degrees, I have options as to what I can focus on in my career. So, and it works with my lifestyle. My partner is also in a long-term program. He's in an MSTP program, so the timing lines up for me also. So just from a life perspective and career perspective, it just was the right choice for me. So
Thank you. An example of creating the intersection of two things that interested you, which is sort of how I ended up in this lab as well, as a cog-sci grad, cognitive science, and now law student. Thank you so much. Professor Meixner, we'll have you go next.
Thanks, Sam. I guess I'll continue the theme of things not being very well scripted or planned out. My story is totally serendipitous and incredibly fortunate. I was a psychology major in undergrad, was very interested in neuroscience in a wide variety of different areas. I had applied to just PhD programs across the country doing a bunch of different sorts of things. And I fell in love with one research program, one lab at Northwestern with this person named Peter Rosenfeld, who is unfortunately passed, but doing research essentially on the neuroscience of deception. It was fascinating. I felt risky to do kind of a narrow sub area, but I got really interested in it and had decided I was probably going to go to Northwestern. And I was on a recruitment visit. I knew nothing about law school. I hadn't thought about law school at all. I was visiting and there was a breakfast the last morning of the visit that I almost skipped, but I decided to go. And sitting at the table where I sat was a student who was in Northwestern's JD PhD program, which I didn't know existed at the time. Amazingly, her first name is Destiny. So I had breakfast with Destiny and learned about the program, realized a lot of what I was interested in from a neuroscience and psychology perspective overlapped with law, both in neuroscience and like judgment and decision-making kind of work. So I took the LSAT, applied to the program, realized I love the law school atmosphere. I love the interactive dynamic of how law school tends to work. And it was a great fit for me. I did the dissertation. We can talk maybe about the substantive stuff later, but I'll also add, like Javier, I spent some time afterwards practicing. So I worked as an AUSA, a federal prosecutor, for about 6 years between doing the PhD and JD and going back into academia. And that was also a really fantastic experience. I saw a lot of the same things Javier was talking about. And I think in a lot of ways, blending some legal practice with the research can really sort of sharpen the way you think about a lot of these areas.
Thank you. And yeah, neuroscience of deception is interesting too, because a growing area of research that we're also working on is how the legal system should deal with the rising influx of neuroscience data, because lawyers are often not scientists. And so the lawyer as scientist is increasingly useful. So that's a great point too. Thank you. Thomas, what does your JD PhD story look like?
Yeah, so before I get into it, Kennedy, nice to see a fellow Meyerhoff, M26, How Fast Dreams. But it's regarding the law school story. I'm going to say that my story sort of breaks the mold relative to the rest of the other panelists, just because I actually decided to quit my PhD, in large part because I had I am very goal oriented. Anybody that knows me knows that I have, when I set an intention, that's how I'm going to go. That's what I'm going to go do. And what I ultimately end up doing is finding the best plan to get there. So my initial undergrad experience, I was part of the Mark Meyerhoff program, also at UMBC, where I was in this magnet program to go on and do a PhD. I originally wanted to study neuroscience, and as part of my PhD, I had a bachelor's in biology, specifically molecular cellular biology, and I was fully dedicated to solving issues related to chronic pain, particularly its pathogenesis and methods of treatment. This stemmed from my wider desire just really to help people, in large part because many of the members of my family suffer from chronic pain. And so I was drawing on partially my personal experience, but also just sort of a general desire that I have to help people. So straight out of undergrad, I go in to start my PhD at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. I am enjoying it. Everything's going swell. And then COVID happened. And, that threw a wrench in everybody's plans, myself included. And one of the things that really sort of inspired my eventual shift to the law, on top of all the general strife, were a lot of talk around sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. I was involved in a lot of those movements prior to the COVID pandemic, but those movements were especially heightened afterwards. And so I joined one organization, the National Science Policy Network, of which I met Jennifer and many other great people who I see in the audience. And through that organization, I was able to understand sort of the blending of science and policy. I got very involved in sort of DEI or DEI related legislation, understanding how that happened. And so through this organization, through other volunteering efforts, I became more and more involved in sort of the people and how to help people through policy and the law, sort of like where are the failings of policy, where did the law get it right, things of that nature. And so when we were coming back to the lab, I started to realize that the passion for my research had died. I was really having trouble maintaining my experiments, especially since I ultimately wasn't able to secure a position in the lab studying chronic pain like I had liked. I ended up studying somatic sensation, which, while still very valuable and still very important, wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. And the most important point for me, at least, was that it didn't have a strict translational aspect. It was much more on the basic science side. And so what I ultimately ended up doing was I left my PhD with my master's, and in one application cycle, I quit, I think it was May of 2022. By that following May, I had a full ride scholarship to Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, and I had worked as a paralegal at the Maryland Legal Aid and as an SEO law fellow at Vincent & Elkins Washington, D.C. office. And throughout the experience, I vastly preferred sort of the pace of the law. I found that a lot of the day-to-day was was a lot faster. It was much more people-centric in a lot of ways. I was able to interact with a lot more people as compared to lab. And so, similar to what Kennedy was saying, just for a lot of life reasons, I ended up much more preferring my journey in law. And I really feel like, at least thus far, I've been able to better service my mission of helping people. So my story is a little different, but I just will absolutely advocate a JD PhD to anybody who wants one. It just wasn't my path.
Thank you so much. And we'll definitely bring up the topic of shaping your educational trajectory around your goals rather than trying to fit your goals into one trajectory or another. So that's a fantastic segue into our next question in a second. Thank you so much. Last but not least, Professor Shen.
Maybe I'll just hold till the end, Sam, and let everyone else jump in. And I have a lot to say, but maybe I'll just say it towards the end.
Okay, sounds great. So then we will take Thomas's segue into the next question, which is, who should consider a JD PhD? What personal and professional goals might benefit from having both degrees? What is sort of the interdisciplinary, vision that brings someone into this path? And we'll let anyone jump in who has thoughts on that.
I can start at the very least, just because I helped kick us off. So for me, for both degrees, a huge part of my decision was practicality. So JD and PhD, both are post-secondary education. JD is very much a professional degree. At what point will I be able to sort of afford a lifestyle that I would like? How will that lifestyle fit in with my partner, with my family, things of that nature? Where is the market? So am I looking at East Coast, West Coast, in the middle, things of that nature? And so like to any sort of like major life decision, there is a degree of practicality that I think people need to consider. And especially when I was in graduate school, finances was a huge aspect for a lot of people's journey. Something that a lot of people don't mention about graduate degrees, at least for biomedical sciences I can speak to, is that you will be taking a significant pay cut relative to if you go straight into post-baccalaureate work. When I was coming up, the high-end graduate student stipend was about $32,000, whereas a bachelor's degree entry-level job could easily net you 50,000 or so. So there is a significant financial aspect that you do need to consider, just for practicality's sake. But in terms of interest areas for whether or not to pursue a JD, PhD, or any sort of post-secondary education, but especially with the joint degrees, is sort of what do you want to accomplish, right? So what I've seen from other JD, PhDs, like on this panel, but also in my own school, and then even with my own experience, having a PhD lends you a lot of skills, especially when it comes to things like research and being able to focus in on one question, and just that one question, being able to really tease apart all the different aspects, right? And the JD will teach you how to translate, how to synthesize a lot of knowledge in the same way that a PhD does, before more of a public policy or law bend, at least as far as I understand it, professors on the panel. But one of the things that I think has been a personal and professional goal for myself, at least, is that having the graduate school experience prior to going into my JD, I feel like I have sort of not just the ability to concentrate for long periods of time while conducting research, I can also know how to plan my research. I'm used to sort of the rigor of graduate school already. And even in my own limited experience, I've actually been able to apply some of my knowledge. So similar to Professor Meisner and Mr. Mesa mentioning the sort of aspects of their work coming through in their clientele, I've been privileged to work with clients with disabilities and knowing how those disabilities manifest, because I know the neurological basis of them, right? And so through that aspect, I was able to tailor my approach to the client, and then be able to deliver a better work product in the end and maintain better client relations in that aspect. And so I think with that sort of greater wealth of knowledge, it does help develop a different discipline, but I think it also will able to help effectuate sort of your goals, whatever they may be, just because it makes you into really a better researcher, a better lawyer, things of that nature. So that's my 2 cents.
I want to jump in, Thomas, because something you said now makes a lot more sense to me, right? I think you said something about, what do you want to accomplish, and think about that before you go in. And I had no idea what I wanted to accomplish when I went into this. The difference is once I was in the midst of the degrees, I figured it out. So I think anybody should consider doing both degrees. Whether or not you actually pull the trigger and do it is a different story, but I think everybody should be welcome to think about it. And, Thomas brought up some considerations that I was already planning on bringing up later, such as opportunity cost and the actual financial cost about pursuing these degrees, which for me, I wasn't paying attention to that when I applied. I knew I was going to do grad school, and that was going to be a long time and cost a lot of money. So I was like, what's 3 more years added onto that? It's fine, or it will be fine. I wouldn't recommend that approach now. If you have a goal of what you want to accomplish, take a deep, hard look. But in general, about who should consider it, do you like solving problems? Because as Thomas also brought up, there are a lot of similarities that aren't apparent to people who don't have a science background or are not interested in the law. Science and law and the actual practice in the day-to-day of being in lab and being an attorney have way more parallels than most people think, right? Do you like solving problems? Do you like interdisciplinary questions? Are you not afraid of not knowing the answer pretty much all the time, right? That's what a dissertation is. You're asking a question and you don't know what the answer is going to be. Sure, you can make an educated guess, but we all know how that turns out most of the time. So, can you really embrace that feeling of uncertainty and just run with it anyway and not let it completely derail you? And, surprise law students or people who have law degrees, right? How much, in the practice of law, the answer is, it depends. There isn't always a concrete answer. It's this protein that has this particular function that's doing this thing. The answer is sometimes and maybe, and well, if you want to. So are you open to that? Or are you someone that's going to be really stressed out about not having a concrete answer and about having to give advice based on an answer that you have that's not concrete? The other thing I wanted to say is that this is a completely untested hypothesis. I'm going to test it on all of you. But in my experience in other organizations like NSPN, shout out to Thomas and some of you in the audience here, I feel like neuroscientists might be inherently more interdisciplinary, just because neuroscience itself is such an interdisciplinary field, right? Chemistry, biology, psychology. Now we have, more and more computer science, behavior. You don't go into neuroscience expecting to just do one of them. You go to neuroscience because you know it's going to involve all of them. And so maybe in some way, neuroscientists are already more open to the idea of alternate career paths and other disciplines because neuroscience itself is that way by just on its own. And I'm gonna stop talking there and let other people jump in, but those are some thoughts.
I'll just chime in and say for folks who are interested in doing some kind of academic career, whether that's a professor or some kind of other research job, I think the joint degree is incredibly valuable if you do any kind of interdisciplinary work. So when I started, I thought I wanted to be an academic. I wasn't sure if that meant a neuroscientist, a psychologist, a law professor. I didn't know, and that kind of came with time as I figured out what areas of research and teaching were interesting to me. But I will say, having both degrees is invaluable daily in my job now. Law schools have sort of increasingly adopted JD, PhD models. I think Professor Shem was kind of in one of the first sort of groups of those people. Now it's really common for folks to have both degrees. And that's because lawyers are always thinking about questions that cross disciplines. Very often the questions we ask require some empirical expertise that you get or methodological expertise that you get through a PhD that you don't necessarily get through teaching at a law school alone. And so all the time, I am thankful for having had formal PhD training that allowed me some time and space to gain those skills, be creative, think about sort of big research questions that I was interested in. So I think if you're an academic, or if you want to be an academic who has some interest in law and some other area, the joint degree is fantastic, and especially through some programs that sort of facilitate doing it in a condensed way. Northwestern's program is great, and I'll leave a link to some of the information in the chat there. Folks at Minnesota are doing awesome things. A lot of good places to do this stuff. Vanderbilt's another great one. So if you're interested in that pathway, I think it's you should seriously consider, I think, both degrees. I'll also just emphasize something I think Thomas said. I do think having had a science background or a PhD background made me think better and more clearly as a lawyer. That you gain analytical skills in doing research, in writing, in a research science, neuroscience sort of way that are valuable to lawyers. I don't know if that would be its own independent reason to do a dual degree if you knew you just wanted to be a practicing lawyer. But I do think there's a lot of overlap in the skills you develop in both programs.
Yeah, I'll jump in. There are some great questions in the chat. So I'm sure for those who've asked them, thank you. And we'll make sure we get to all of them. And maybe I can take on a couple as I offer a few comments. So maybe I'll give my story now, and then it'll segue into a couple of things I want to say. So I entered a joint JD PhD program. I took a year off, gap year, and then I entered the program. But my PhD program was in the social sciences, political science, public policy, economic sociology, pretty much wide range of social sciences, a lot of law, a lot of big data work and quantitative work, but no natural sciences and no neurobiology. And if you had asked me at that moment when I was starting my JD PhD program to list 100 things that I might do after graduation, I would not have listed law and neuroscience. And if you expand it and said, all right, well, you get 1,000 chances to write, I still wouldn't have listed it. And I just don't think I would have listed even if you gave me unlimited numbers. A couple of reasons for that. One, it wasn't a thing at all. We published the first law and neuroscience casebook, and 90% of the material is published after the year 2000, which is when I graduated college. So that's part of the story. The other part of the story is that it just wasn't, it just didn't, it's like, why should I study neuroscience? My story really hinged, and this is one of the points I want to make about mentorship. I ended up with one particular professor which wasn't even in my orbit, but somebody suggested I go speak to him because I was working on issues of trauma in my dissertation, legal and policy responses to trauma, those who had survived trauma in the battlefield and those who had survived trauma related to sexual violence. But I had no idea about what was happening in the mind and the brain with respect to these really difficult mental moments. Ended up in this professor's office. He became my singular mentor, connected me with a postdoc in law and neuroscience that unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. There was, in fact, no postdocs that I'm aware of right now in law and neuroscience exists. Now, footnote, we're really working hard to try and create some. So I want to make a point about mentorship. It's really, really important. Second point is that you're going to have to work hard to create your own programs. Still to this day, it's a little better than it was. Like we have this program, which had been really cool back in the day. And there are a handful of schools that are open to this, but it's still a lot of entrepreneurial spirit. And then the third thing I'd say is that you've really, at some point, you've got to decide whether you're going to be more of a law person with neuro knowledge. So I'd put Professor Meixner and Attorney Brown in that. That is, they're every day waking up and doing law stuff, but as they've said, they leverage their neuroscience knowledge to do it better, versus a neuroscientist who's got a real understanding of the law. For instance, maybe you wake up every day and you run your experiments and run your lab, but you do it in a way and you expand the impact of your lab's work because you care about law and policy. Those are different things. They involve totally different job markets. The dynamics are different. And the things that you would do to be successful on those markets is different. Because as much as there's the interest and interdisciplinariness sort of at the high level or on websites, when it comes down to hiring, most of the folks who are going to hire you are going to not be in that same space and sort of going to wonder, well, why? I'm a law person. Why are you talking to me about neuroscience? Or I'm a card-carrying bench neuroscientist. Why are you talking to me about legal concepts? Now, you can pull that to your advantage, as everyone on this panel has, but it's important to navigate that and to connect those all together. If you're in a situation where it's tough to do and you kind of have to do it by yourself, all the more reason to have mentorships. And I'll plug our career network. This session and beyond, we're here to try and help answer some questions. And I can just answer one of the questions here, which is a really great one. And it's different between the PhD program and law. In general, you have to pay for law school. You may get a scholarship, which can cover some tuition, but in general, the idea is that that's a professional program preparing you to make a decent amount of money, and you can take out your own loans if you can't afford it. There are scholarships available, potentially, but they're merit-based. They're not need-based. We can talk separately if you want to. Anyone who's been in my lab has heard me talk about the LSAT, and it's important. We'll talk about that later. PhD programs are generally funded. And sometimes if you hit gold, you can get some of the law school covered through the PhD program, but not always. It depends on the school and the timing and a whole bunch of other factors. So I'll just say that was one of the questions. There are lots of other questions, but there are other people who want to speak. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I may jump off that into our final sort of structured topic, which gets at some of the questions in the chat as well as points our panelists have raised, which is that JD and PhD degrees, each on their own, enable a lot of opportunities professionally, academically, and otherwise. And so my final topic for all of you is it really worth it to get both degrees? What advantages and disadvantages, professionally, personally, or otherwise, come with the dual degree path? How might those interested in interdisciplinary work accomplish their goals with just a JD or just a PhD, as well as any other thoughts you have on the sort of professional and practical side of the pathway?
I can start because I wanted to jump off something Francis had mentioned about the more lawyer neuroscientist versus the more neuroscientist lawyer. Not only are those completely different day to day, the materials you use to apply to those jobs are completely different. So if you're in your PhD program, you're submitting a CV when you apply to your PhD, which can be pages and pages and pages and pages and list everything you've ever done and all of your publications and all of your presentations and how great you are. When you're on the law side, you get one page, and it's a resume. And do not think that you can just cut, the first page of your CV and that's a resume. That is not true. It will not work. So Francis, I wanted to reiterate that, right? So not only is what you do different, the way you get there and what you need to do to prepare is different. But I'm also going to say you can do things not knowing which way you're going to go that set you up well for both. So for example, I published both in law and in neuroscience because I wasn't sure which way I was going to go. And that's something that was valuable no matter which way. It was something that, will stay on my CV or resume. So there are ways to do it where you're thinking about things that might be useful in both tracks. There are, you hear this word transferable skills, you have transferable skills that you can use for both. So that was just a comment I wanted to make. And then opportunity cost, Thomas talked about this a lot, in terms of financially, but it's going to cost you in career development time, right? If you're going straight from your undergrad to a job, you're going to gain experience, you're going to grow in whatever corporate structure you're in, you're going to be making way more money than you would as a PhD student or a law student at the same time. So that's going to set you up financially better. And if you know there's something really specific you want to do, it may be that a PhD or a law degree isn't the best answer for you. It might be that you want to pursue a master's in public health or a certificate in law of some kind, or a master's degree rather than a PhD. It really comes down to, if you're that specific, if you already know deep in your heart, which I did not, what your goal is, you go talk to more people about whether or not you really need these 2 degrees, because I think I saw a question in the chat about time, right? So the average PhD, I don't know what it is. I want to say the average was around 5.7 years. Professors, please chime in on this. What's the average time to degree right now?
Sounds about right to me.
So you're taking that 5.5, and that's the average, plus you're adding 3 years of law school, maybe slightly less if you manage to do a combined program and count credits. That's 8 years. That's a pretty long time. Even if it's 7, it's still a pretty long time. So think about that. The other thing is it worth it? Can you handle nobody understanding why you're doing what you're doing? Because people are going to be asking you questions all the time. Why are you doing this? Can you explain it to me? You just need to be able to answer them, and don't let it get to you. You know why you're doing it, and you're going to do fine.
Yeah, one piece of advice I usually give is the same advice I've heard given to those who want to pursue acting as a career, which is that if you can find any way that you're going to be really satisfied with that doesn't involve both degrees, then don't do them. You have to really have a lot of energy and interest and passion to start the track, because just as Jen said, it's a long haul and it's going to have a lot of ups and downs. And so if you don't start pretty high, those downs are going to take you to a place that's not a good place. So I think that's good. I do remember vividly the day my opportunity cost rose. I did a JD PhD at Harvard. And so 2006, I graduated the law school, and all my friends, went off to very large paychecks. And I went back to my stipend, which I think then was about $21,000, which I thought was great because, that was great for me. But it's probably not profit maximizing to pursue a JD PhD. Now, it doesn't mean you can't do really well. You can, but you can also do really well without the PhD, especially if you're a pure kind of JD lawyer. I want to add one note too, that in addition, Attorney Brown, what you're saying about different applications for jobs once you have the degrees, there are different application processes for getting into these 2 programs, really different. Law school is pretty straightforward. Get really good grades and kill it on the LSAT, and then do all the other usual things that make for a good application. PhD programs in neuroscience are much more of a black box, and PhD programs in general are much more idiosyncratic. I got into some PhD programs, I didn't get into others. It was like, why? I have no idea. And it's a much more personal experience, which also, by the way, means it could be a much more systemically biased experience. We're going to run a separate program called How to Get Into PhD Program. Yvonne, in our lab, is not on this call, but he's been doing humans work to try and get that program together. So come back for that one separately. But I just want to flag that if you're at the undergraduate level and you're thinking, boy, I want to pursue these degrees, maybe you have to kind of strategically think about both. And I really agree with trying to then find ways to navigate so that you set yourself up for success potentially in both fields.
If I can add to Francis's comment, I do think it's one potential sort of advantage of doing a bifurcated path, right? Like getting one degree first and then the other, is that you usually set yourself up with a nice parachute. Like if things go wrong, obtaining the second degree, I got my JD first, and that's a golden parachute. I don't like to think of my legal career as a safety net by any means. But if things don't work out and I decide I'm year 6, I'm going to finish this PhD. But hypothetically, if at an earlier time, if there are ups and downs, and if I wanted an off ramp, law is a pretty good one. And I would imagine someone who did it the opposite and got their PhD first have a lot of opportunities with the PhD if you decide that law school is not something that you want to see through to the end. So, but that being said, as someone who's done the bifurcated path, my life just kind of ended up this way where I went down one course. I wanted to hone in on some deeper questions, and I'm happy to use my energies to pursue a PhD. It is expensive in more than a financial sense. Opportunity costs are high. You got to have energy. Some of my friends are having children, they're buying houses. I am in school. I love being in school. It's the right choice for me. I don't have any doubts about that. And I think that once I'm out of school, I will catch up very quickly. But yeah, so just something to consider. If JD PhD sounds a little daunting, bifurcated path has off ramps for you before you commit to an extended period of time.
Okay, thank you all. We promised we'd leave some time for audience questions. I'll kick off reading one out that I don't think we've touched on quite yet, and then we'll invite people to unmute if they like. This audience member says, can you highlight any ongoing research or recent advancements in neurolaw that showcase the significance of a combined JD-PhD approach in comparison to a neuroscience undergrad degree combined with a JD? So, in other words, can you show off what the interdisciplinary field can do?
Yeah, I could take that one. So there was a case just decided last week in Massachusetts, a state case called Mattis. I'll put the site in the link. There were 3 experts, all of whom I know, who testified. And this case had to do with the question of whether under the Massachusetts state constitution, you could have life without the possibility of parole for young adults, those 18, 19, and age 20. And the court in Massachusetts, changing the law dramatically, said, no, you can no longer do that. And they relied heavily on developmental neuroscience. And of the 3 experts, one's Adriana Galvan, card-carrying neuroscientist, just a PhD. But the other 2, one for the prosecution, one for the defense, were JD PhDs. And in particular, Dr. Robert Kinshriff, JD PhD. His testimony really weaved both the law and the science together. So I think that's a really clear example where, and then by the way, I'll tell you that we spent the rest of that week actually on Thursday and Friday talking with 25 Massachusetts state judges, again, thanks to the Dana Foundation for supporting that work. And one of the comments afterwards was, wow, you really are bringing us the science, said the judges, but you understand the context in which we're working. So I think those are some really concrete examples. I'm sure there are a lot more. Well, I'm not sure. I know there are a lot more. We try and circulate some of them, but that's just one concrete example where I think Dr. Kinshriff's experience, both understanding the law and the science, really matter. Well, and the other thing too, I just want to note, because there was a question about it, the place where most JD PhDs end up neuro is in intellectual property law, patent law. And the reason, and it's not just PhDs in neuroscience, but PhDs in other scientific fields. The reason is that those cases are so complex. You're talking about the details of some microchip. It really, really helps if the attorney understands the underlying science and engineering or whatever the relevant science is. So there was a question if law firms sometimes hire PhDs, and they do. It's not the reverse. I don't know of any neuroscience department that has someone with just a JD. That might change slightly a little bit here and there in neuroethics. So it doesn't go both ways.
Okay, if there's anyone in the audience who'd like to unmute and ask a question live, we invite you to do that. Otherwise, we can work through some more questions from the chat.
Don't be shy.
Hi, so I'm actually right now, I finished my PhD and I'm interested in pursuing a JD. And I'm working at a law firm, I'm doing IP work, and I'm just wondering, other than IP law, like how does a day in the life of an attorney who has a JD PhD and doesn't do IP law, what does that look like? What are you working on? Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
I can give you one example. When I was practicing as a prosecutor, my PhD didn't directly affect every single day of practice, but I very routinely handled sentencing hearings. Was one of the most important things I did as a prosecutor. And a big part of my job was deciding what sentence to recommend to the judge. And part of that also involved trying to convince supervisors in my office what I thought was the appropriate sentence, which sometimes was below, what the sort of guideline recommended sentence was. And I often talked to them about neuroscience research, about juvenile brain development, about addiction, things like what Javier was talking about, and trying to explain why I thought a lower sentence was warranted and was what the government should recommend in that case. So it wasn't, the core of my practice, but it was an area where having that background and a serious understanding of the science, I thought was really helpful to my practice.
I can also give you another one. So I'm in the healthcare and life sciences division, not technically in the IP division. And so a lot of my practice is regulatory work. That's med device, pharmaceuticals, data privacy and security. And a lot of it is, I don't need the PhD, kind of like what John is saying, but in a lot of ways, things will come across my desk where it gives me an extra depth of knowledge for what I'm doing. So here's one example. I'm looking at diligence for a transaction that a client is looking to do, and the device that in question relies on neural stimulation in order to have the effect that it has clinically. Now, do I need to know that to do a lot of the law? Maybe not. But if I'm talking to the client, or if I'm looking into these, reading thousand pages of documents about it, does it help to have a more fundamental understanding of what this device is and how it's working? I think so. And I think it helps when talking to the client too. They don't have to explain to you why this nerve stimulation this particular way has this particular effect. You already know. So you already are starting off with that kind of common ground.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that last thing you just said, Jen, about talking with clients. These are credentials, and I don't think one should overlook the power of the credential. So one of the things you realize really quickly when you go out there in the world is that others don't have a lot of time to assess who you are. They can't take a long time to get your backstory, and maybe you have been reading every neuroscience book for the last decade, but they don't know that. It just says JD. But as soon as you have that credential, people just look up. You're also able to speak the language of that discipline. That may or may not matter to you. It matters if you're talking with experts in some areas on the legal side. But the credentialing can have an effect. And so even if it doesn't affect every day of practice, I have some colleagues who do this work, and they're sort of known in their firm or in their unit as the go-to person for this or that because of that experience. So again, it's a lot of time to work just for a credential, but but it does matter and sometimes in those ways. Good
Thank
question.
you. Thank you.
Anyone else who'd like to unmute? If not, I can pose a sort of synthesized question for the audience. But
yeah, there was another question in the chat too, Sam, that I was going to try and take if nobody has one. Let's scroll back up. This was just it was a concrete question from a first-year neuroscience PhD student. Do most people get law internships during a PhD, or is the JD application process started after the PhD? I think everyone here may have had a slightly different experience. I don't know, Kennedy, if you want to talk about yours and kind of how you're structuring your experience, or if others want to jump in, because I don't think there's a single right answer, and everyone kind of takes a different path to going between the two.
Yeah, I can talk about my experience. So I'm doing my entire PhD first, and then I'm going to go to the law school. So I am not doing an internship, any sort of law internship during my PhD, but I have been doing work that kind of focuses on an intersection between neuroscience and law. Um, Me and Jennifer have worked on a paper together that kind of focuses on um, kind of the topic of chimeras and the work with interspecies organ donation and kind of how the law kind of regulates that entire topic. So I've able to kind of focus on that without actually doing an internship. And then I plan on actually doing the law internship when I get into law school. And that was my personal path.
Maybe anyone could comment on this question too, which I have a thought on, which was when to apply to law school? What if you've started the PhD program? How do you break the news to your PI that you're thinking about law school or you want to go? I'm wondering how we've navigated those.
I think, Kennedy, maybe expand a little bit on some of the discussions we had. You didn't just decide that you were going to do your PhD and then do law. It was a lot. There was a lot more that went into that decision for you. I know. So why don't you expand a little bit? Because I think that struggle is what these people, you know, a lot of them are facing themselves.
So I started off, when I was in my junior year, I took the LSAT and I didn't do as well as I expected. So I decided to go through with the PhD. And then I was connected through my PI that I am under right now, Dr. Walter Lowe, to Jennifer. And we talked and I kind of picked her brain, had many meetings with her. I was like, how did you do this? How does this work? And she kind of told me her path. And I was like, well, maybe I'll jump back and forth and I'll go, you know, do the PhD for a year or two, then jump into law school, kind of like how she did. But she applied to both programs simultaneously. And I was in the program, in the PhD program first. So after talking to her and talking to my PI, who was very supportive, by the way, he was like, I see the vision, I'm with you. I think you should move forward. I decided that I was going to try and apply in my fourth year and defer for 1 year and then go into the law program. That's my path that I'm thinking of right now. And not just because it would be easier to kind of just finish one program before doing the next one. I also kind of wanted to make sure that when I was working through my thesis, my committee also knew that I had a commitment after the fact that I was working towards. And I didn't want any confusion or them to feel like, well, maybe academia is really what you want to do and kind of convince me into another path when I knew where I was going. So that's kind of how I decided to structure my JD PhD. But I know from talking to Jen, she kind of did it completely different from what I did, and that worked for her, but that's kind of what worked for me. So,
and I did it the way I did because I didn't have a choice. By applying together, there was a memorandum of understanding between the law school and the graduate program in neuroscience that Professor Shen has seen. You know, they had no idea what to do with somebody who wanted to do both, but they were willing to work with me to make it happen. But in order to do that, I had to jump through a lot of really weird hoops to make both schools happy. And that's what led to me doing this kind of weird alternating thing. So I entered into the graduate program in neuroscience, deferring my law school acceptance by 1 year, completed my preliminary exams in neuroscience, and then did 2 years of law school back to back. So I did the normal 1L and 2L, and then went back to my neuroscience program for the next 3 years to finish my PhD before doing 1 semester of law to finish. And that was due to a lot of really arcane rules that luckily have since been dismantled. And so Kennedy actually has a lot more flexibility in some ways. But these are just kind of the pros and cons, the costs and balances, the things you have to weigh when you're at any particular institution, because every institution is also going to be different.
That was my question. Can I just follow that up and ask, because I know you guys were talking about deferring. Does every law school let you defer? Because I haven't had that experience talking with them.
No, they don't. It really depends on their yield and sort of their strategy, but the answer is no, they don't. But some do. And it just sort of depends. There's not a single answer. But I will say that it's really important if you can to have a supportive PI and a supportive institution. It's a tough enough to do it on your own. It's even tougher if you feel like you're fighting the administration and you feel like you can't be yourself and you have to sneak around and secretly study for the LSAT or something. Um, and there's a great set of questions. I mean, Sam, this is your bucket, which says, well, do I have to get a PhD in neuro? What if I studied neuro as an undergrad, And I don't know, Sam, if you want to say anything about that. You work in our lab. Maybe, you studied neuroscience as an undergrad and been fit right in.
Sure, just briefly, I got an undergrad degree in cognitive science with a neuroscience concentration and minor, and I'm now a third-year law student in this lab. So I sort of had a similar situation as Kennedy at the beginning, explaining how there was this neuroscience interest and then this law interest, and I had these things floating around that I didn't know how to combine. And then I ended up here. So, there you can sort of build your own combination. My research in the lab now focuses on how the law should confront neuroscience advancements and new neurotechnology, particularly as evidence in the courtroom. So definitely more from the law perspective, because that's sort of what my more advanced degree is. But that's an example of, I don't have a PhD and I'm not planning to get one, but I can still combine the two fields.
I know we're at time, but I also, I can stay in a couple minutes longer if anybody wants, but I feel like Thomas kind of needs to speak up here, because Thomas did something that I think takes a tremendous amount of courage, which is to quit your PhD program because you realize it's not getting you where you want to go. And so Thomas, you have a master's now and are thriving. I think maybe also just because I know that I'm not saying this randomly, everyone in the audience, I know these people outside of this meeting. So
Yeah, no, for sure. And Jennifer definitely knows, because she was actually one of the first people to introduce me to the possibility of pursuing the law after a PhD. The other one was Reynaldo Franqui. He has a website out there which I can endeavor to find and circulate afterward. That really helps highlight sort of the transition from a PhD to a JD, especially if you're interested in IP, but not necessarily have to be. Yeah, I quit my PhD. I am feeling so much better afterwards. Like, I'll be completely candid there. I went into my program bright-eyed and full of hope, and I left feeling awful. I enjoyed all my research for the most part, but there was just a series of events that just made everything so much harder, like even beyond COVID, right? So first shot, I wasn't able to get into the lab that I actually wanted to be in. That makes things a lot harder when you're trying to grind out a PhD, but your research isn't necessarily what you want to be doing. Kills your motivation, makes it so much harder to get through. So I had that obstacle to go with. After returning, I found out that I actually couldn't do my experiments anymore. I used to do, a series of surgeries, and I lost my tolerance. Like, I would actually start to pass out at the sight of the blood. And so I realized that I probably shouldn't be doing this anymore. And so as part of that calculus, after a series of long conversations with my PIs, I was in my fourth year. So like we said earlier, PhD is typically 5.5, 6 years, right? I was in my fourth year. I lost the ability to do the experiments that my thesis was founded on. And so I had to pivot. And when we did the over under of sort of like how long this will take for my PhD now, I was looking at a 7.5, 8 year degree, which for a PhD is a very long time. And I realized, I pulled my head up from the miasma of feeling like I wasn't doing my PhD correctly, and realized that, this isn't going to get me where I want to be. Like, I wanted to work in government. I still would like to work in government. I want to serve people, and I want to do things that are relevant to solving people's problems, and nothing in this PhD is doing that. So this PhD no longer serves my interests. So I made the very hard choice to first, I tried to switch labs. And after trying many, many, many times, had no takers. So I left. And so I left. By that point, I had already completed, I was a PhD candidate, right? So I had earned my master's degree. I left with my master's degree. And then somebody in the chat, I think, mentioned making that transition. I I'd taken the LSAT, I had gone through the applications, gotten I was working 3 jobs to make ends meet. Like, I was going through it. But now I've gotten into my program, I'm so much happier. Really enjoying the law and really enjoying being able to apply my different research aspects while still getting to work for people. I'm really looking forward to beginning clinic next semester. Something that you get to do in law school is you actually get to practice in a very limited capacity through something called clinic. It's a practical course where you get to work with real clients on real issues under the supervision of a teacher. Very looking forward to that. I've already gotten to do pro bono volunteering aspects, like things like that. So, like Jennifer was saying, if this isn't what you want to do, that's completely fine. If that's, you get into it fully believing this is something you want to do and you realize that you don't want to do it anymore, that's totally fine too. There's merits in leaving. So, you serve no one by forcing yourself to be there. So if you don't want to be there, leave. Otherwise, stick through it, get your credentials, get the skills that you want, and use it for the goals that you ultimately want to serve. So that was my dream.
Okay, thanks to all our panelists. I know we're over time, so we want to respect everyone's evening and end there. I'll just invite Professor Shen to close us out with some words on finding opportunities in this area.
Yeah, first of all, thank you to all of our panelists. Thanks to all of you for being here. Like you said, it's really neat. This wouldn't have happened a decade ago, both the subject, but also the number of people. I mean, we would have put up a shingle and nobody would have shown up. So this is really cool. Great question. So the recording will be posted to neuroxcareers.org. Give us a couple days to get that up and running. Because you've signed up for this event, you'll now be on our newsletter where we try and put relevant postings, not just in neurolaw, but in neuroethics and neurotheology and neuroarchitecture and all kinds of neuroX fields. And we're excited. Stay tuned. We're going to be running a kind of NeuroX 101 series starting soon, neurotheology 101, neurolaw 101. You can track us down at info@neuroxcareers.org. We have a new full-time Dana Fellow, and we're really excited to support your journey as you navigate this. And I think I speak probably for all the panelists in saying you can track us down too. We're not hard to find. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sam, for moderating. I'm going to close out the meeting and stop the recording. Thanks. Bye.